Okay, good afternoon, everyone. So we were going through the PyTorch details for these deep convolutional networks. And one thing we did is we loaded the VGG16 model. And we were looking at the structure of the model, and we saw that there were some feature layers. That's where we find our convolutions. And then there's the classifier layer, which has all dense linear layers. And then in between is the average pool layer, and that thing is used to make sure that you can put in any size image in the input, and it will always make sure that the size of the feature maps going into your classifier layer are always the right size, the same size that it was trained for. So that's VGG16. And so now let's apply VGG16, the trained model, to classification. So we're just going to go on Flickr, and we're going to get some images of elephants. So there's a demo for this, but and you'll need this for the lab of Unit 9. But you need to get some API keys from Flickr, and then once you have them, you can interact with it, and you can download images. And just a few details. The way we're going to do it, you have to use separate train and test directories, and then within each one, you have separate class subdirectories. For this demo, there's only one class, elephants, but then in the lab, there will be two classes, bicycles and cars. So you'll have two directories in each. So for PyTorch to work with the data set, use the image folder function, and that is what assumes this kind of structure here. It creates a dataset object, and as part of this, so here's the line. So this tells you where, I believe this is the directory to find the data, and then this tells you what kind of transformations it's going to apply on the images. And so one thing is that we're going to do here is we're going to crop to 224 by 224. So if the image is any larger, it's going to crop it down. We're also going to convert to a torch tensor, and we need to do this because the data starts in NumPy format, and then we need to convert it to that. And so there's okay. And then there's also a normalization that is important to use whenever you work with ImageNet data. So basically with ImageNet, you want that the red, green, and blue channels have particular means and variances. Otherwise, the network, the way that it's trained will be different from the way that you're giving it the data. So, so this is what this normalized layer does, is it wants that the red channel has this mean and standard deviation, green, blue. Okay. So, and then here's how we put those three transforms together. First, I think let's see, torch tensor before, okay. So I think the first thing it does is crop, then it converts to a tensor, and then normalizes. And so that transform is something that it does in this image folder, in this dataset object. That's where you tell it the transformations to use. Okay, and then once you have that set up, you tell your data loader about that data set, and then you can tell the batch size. We're just going to use a batch size of 10, so it's going to grab 10 images, put them through the network. Okay, so, and then we're going to classify them. So we have all the weights in the model. We don't need to train anything. We just want to see, will it recognize that these images that we downloaded are, in fact, elephants. So, so here's what we do. We put the model in evaluation mode rather than training mode, and we do this with Torch NoGrad, which makes sure that all these steps, it's not computing gradients because it doesn't need to do backpropagation. So we take the image, put it through the model, get the output, and then that output is going to be, there's no activation layer at the end. This is just a real number. So we're going to put that through a softmax, which is going to turn it into an approximate probability and a vector of probabilities. And then we can look at that output, and we can look for the top 3 categories. So you can tell it like how many categories to look at. So what it's going to do is going to look through this vector of probabilities, find the 3 largest ones. So for example, the very first image in our batch has, it thinks it's an African elephant with probability about 70%, a tusker with probability 28, an Indian elephant with probability 1.8, and so on. And there's more. So for all the 1,000 ImageNet categories, it has some probability, but as you can see, the probabilities fall off pretty quickly. If you add 70 and 28, that alone is 98, and then very quickly, these go to 0. So that's for the first image. For the second image, you can see has the same labeling. For the third one, just kind of a variation: tusker, African elephant, Indian elephant, and so on. So, so you can see for all these 10 images, it correctly predicted that it was some sort of variation on an elephant. I don't know. Yeah, there could be African and Indian elements because we just got elephant directories from Flickr, so maybe it is correctly categorizing these. I'm not sure. And there's a small error on the slide. This does not apply. I had changed this last year, and I forgot to take out that bullet point. So all these are being correctly classified. Okay, so that's classification. Now what we can do is we can also write a little function that will pull out the feature maps inside the network so we can actually look at them. So that's what this feature extractor does. So this is going to, so this is a, object-oriented. So here we have the initialization code, and then there's just one function, the forward model. And so in the initialization code, what it's going to do is you're going to give it the module. Well, let's see. I think this is, this is going to be like the entire VGG model. And then it's going to, okay, so within the VGG model, there's a list of which are the feature layers and which are the classifier layers. And so it's just going to store those in self-feature layers, self-classifier layers. And then when you go through the forward model, this is, I said it wrong before. This is what you actually specify when you run this function. You give it 3 inputs. You give it the model, which is going to be our VGG model. You tell it which feature layers you want to extract to save like the feature maps so we can look at them, and which classifier layers to do that for. And then, so as we go through the forward function, we initialize feature outputs, classifier outputs to empty arrays. And then we have a for loop here, which basically goes through the different feature modules. So it's like for name module in, and then this is self.model. This is like VGG 16 features. And so it goes through those feature modules, puts our data through the module, and then if that module is one of the ones that we asked to save, it will add the feature outputs to this array. So it will just kind of strip out the ones it wants to keep, accumulate them in here, and then eventually it reports that. It does the same thing for the classifier modules down here. And in the middle, you can see we have the adaptive average pool step, just to make sure that this is just something that happens in the middle of the model. So when we're done running the forward model, we have a feature outputs stored and classifier outputs stored, and then we can visualize it. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. So here's what it looks like. So this is the original image. It's an RGB image, so we're plotting red, green, blue. So you can see, obviously it looks like an elephant. Then we go through the first layer activations, and we're going to get a whole bunch of, I'm trying to remember how many we have. Let's see. You can see over here, 64. So there's going to be 64 of these, but we're only going to plot 4 of them. So these still look more or less like an elephant because each of these has been filtered using that 3x3 kernel in the first layer. So you can see that some of them are emphasizing more like the vertical things. It's hard to know exactly what they're doing, but you can still recognize elephants here. But as you get to layer 10, this is feature module. Yeah, feature module. So layer 10, or if the way that PyTorch is counting feature modules, like the batch norm is one module, or yeah, the ReLU is another, and so on. So basically, layer 10 within the convolutional layers, you can see that this thing doesn't really look anything like an elephant. These are things that have been learned that only make sense to this network, and that are eventually going to be used in the classification layer. So the point is that as you start out with things that are recognizable to humans as images, and as you go through your network, they just get gradually changed, and they get more and more specific to that network and things that it's trying to learn. Okay, so just sort of a demonstration of how you can look at what's actually in the middle of that network. Okay, any questions on anything? Okay, all right, so so just for the rest of the lecture, I'm just going to talk about sort of generalizing what we've talked about, and this is just a lot of information, so it's not important to understand all the details here, but hopefully you find some of it interesting. So everything we've talked about so far has been about image classification. So image classification basically says, give you an image which may have many things in it, but there's only a single label for that image. And your objective is to figure out what is that label. So like for this image, which does have a cat, but it has grass, it has sky, it has trees and all that, it's just labeled cat. And so our objective is to get the label cat. But if you think about this problem, there's all sorts of other things you might want to learn from that image beyond just the one single label. So, so let me just go through the pictures, maybe they tell the story better. So there's a problem called, or a task called segmentation. So in segmentation, the idea is that every single pixel in the image is basically in one of several classes. So for example, for this image, there might be a sky class, trees class, grass, and cat. And this segmentation network has, for every one of the pixels, has labeled it one of those 4 classes and then plotted it as, a different color here. So really, it's doing classification on a pixel level, in some sense. That's what segmentation is. It's doing a little bit more than that because semantic segmentation says it knows about ImageNet, or it knows about some data set that it was trained with, and it knows that maybe there's these 4 classes, but there's actually maybe even other ones out there. And it has to figure out, which class, which pixels these are in. Okay, another task you can imagine is classification plus localization. So here you're recognizing that the main thing in the image is the cat, but you're also providing a bounding box that shows where in the image you find that cat. Another related thing, but a little harder, is object detection. That's where you recognize that there's many different objects within the image, and you want to figure out what those objects are and put bounding boxes around every one. So here it's saying there's a dog here, there's another dog here, there's another cat here, and perhaps, it could have also said tree, couch, and so on, depending on what kind of data it was trained with. Might do that or might not. And then this instance segmentation is not only is it saying, it's kind of like this, but it's saying, I don't want you to just give me a bounding box. I actually want you to say, for the dog that's recognized, this particular dog, tell me which pixels that dog is occupying. So it came up with these pixels. And then for the second dog, it came up with these pixels. And for the cat, these pixels. So as you can see, there's all sorts of different variations of these classification-like problems that can be formulated. And different tasks like autonomous driving and so on, would be interested in some of these. Autonomous driving, you're not interested just to know that there's a pedestrian in front of you. You want to know where that pedestrian is. You also want to know if there's a sign and what else is going on, and et cetera, et cetera. So that's, classification, object detection, segmentation. These are various versions of that. Then there's completely different stuff that, like image compression. So what I'm talking about here is classical things like JPEG image compression. That's based on an algorithm that was, developed in the 80s probably. And the question is, can I do that same thing, but can I do it better using a neural network? And the answer is yes, you can, and that's what that's what I'm referring to here as a task for image-based training a neural network to do something with images. There's many other tasks. Image denoising is one where you're given a noisy image, and your whole objective is to remove the noise and just show the image. Deblocking, the idea is the image was compressed, maybe poorly by some JPEG algorithm, and it looks blocky, and can I follow it up with a neural network to get rid of that blockiness? So for example, you've all seen this when watching TV, if it's like digital TV, and there's some sort of interference, you'll get this really weird blocky screen for a moment, right? So it's like, could you have a neural network that just fixes that? Just turns that into a nicer looking image. That would be deblocking. Deblurring is you're given a blurry image, can you sharpen it? Other things you can do with image recovery, super resolution there, the idea is you're given a small image and you want to expand it to make it big, but if you just do that in the traditional way, it would just look big and kind of over smooth or blurry. So you want to make it big and then also sharpen it. So changing the resolution. So that's super resolution. Phase retrieval is the idea is somehow you have been given Fourier measurements of something, but you've only been given the magnitudes of those images. So this happens with X-ray crystallography, which is the technique that they use to first visualize DNA, those double helix and all that. There's a lot of different applications where maybe because you're working at super high bandwidths, you can measure intensity in the Fourier domain, but you cannot measure phase. So I'm not an expert on optics, but I think a lens is in some sense doing a Fourier transform, and there's applications in microscopy where the problem with a microscope is that the thickness of the lens prevents how close you can get to the sample. And if you want to get really close to the sample, you have to take out the lens. And that means you have to do what the lens does in software, essentially. And that involves phase retrieval. If you try to do that, you end up getting a phase retrieval problem. It's like you see the Fourier domain, but you only see the intensity, you don't see the phase. So can you reconstruct the phase just from the intensities? Magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, is something that's used to image body, soft tissues, and so on. And in that problem, you also make measurements in the Fourier domain, but you don't sample the Fourier domain at Nyquist rates. You collect only a few measurements in the Fourier domain because you want to try to speed up the MRI process, which would maybe take a half an hour if you didn't do this. So you try to speed it up by just taking a fraction of the measurements. And now you don't actually have enough measurements to really reconstruct the image, but maybe you can have a large training data set that's like, here's all what we think the images should look like, here are the measurements, put them together to get a nice, sharp, clean image of what was actually there. Computed tomography is similar, but it's a different way of doing medical imaging. In painting is a problem where maybe I give you like a picture of a cat, but then somehow something is missing, and I want to fill in that, or maybe there's maybe there's text written on top of the image, and I want to figure out like what pixels are being hidden by that text. So I don't have the text there. That would be in painting, or image completion is another way to say that. And then I'll talk about this in the next few slides. Image generation is sort of a very exciting application where you have a bunch of data, a bunch of examples of images, and you want to make up new images that look like those examples but are different. They're, you want to make up faces that there's no human that has exactly that face, but it looks like there is. So I'll talk more about that in a moment. And notice that this is all just imaging. There's many, many applications, obviously, outside imaging that you can use deep networks for. When you look at the deep networks that are applied to these, sometimes they look like our convolutional nets that we've been looking at, but sometimes they're very different. I guess one major difference is that for a lot of these applications, the number of outputs and the number of inputs to the network are the same, right? Whereas the networks we've been looking at, you have 224 squared inputs, but then 1,000 outputs because there's 1,000 classes. So if you're doing regression, a lot of these tasks these are all regression tasks. Then number of outputs might be the same as the number of inputs, and so you need a completely different network design. UNet is a very popular one for all of those, for all of these applications. Another really interesting class of networks are recurrent networks. It's where you have a network that has an output, but then somehow the output is fed back to the input. So the data just kind of goes round and round. And you may have seen similar things like in 5200 or maybe 3050, you've seen recursive filters where the output of the filter is fed back to the input to make a more powerful filter. So this is the same sort of thing, except this is nonlinear. So there's those, and then the simplest versions don't work that well, but there's some more powerful versions like this. These LSTMs are basically like these things, but with a lot of extra tricks to make them work better. I'll tell you about some of these other things in a few more slides. And transformers are a new approach that is not based on convolution. It's based on other ideas. And in its basic form, it's a lot more expensive than convolution, so you have to try to find either tricks around that or you just have to have incredible processing power. But that's a lot of convolutional networks are now getting slowly replaced by transformers because they're more powerful if you have the capabilities to train them. Okay. Any questions on anything on this page?
So what is the criteria for selection of neural network for a particular application?
There's no criteria. It's more like experimentation, ingenuity. People are still dreaming up new architectures and claiming that architecture works better on this task. So you can, kind of look at what's been done so far, and that's a starting point. You can see, can I improve it? Things like that. Yeah, it's much more of an art than a science, really. A lot of this stuff. Yeah.
Would you say that the performance on those different tasks of these deep learning networks, they're like good, fairly good on all of those, or there are any that you could highlight as like, oh, not so good yet?
I think by now it's probably the deep networks have beaten just about everything. I mean, yeah, they're still trying to beat humans in some tasks, but they've beaten humans in a lot of tasks, like whether it's playing chess or whatever games, or I think probably even on things like MNIST, data sets like that, if you had a human, like I'm not sure what human performance is, but my guess is that better networks are better than humans for MNIST, probably.
Are the bottom row of example networks, are those not deep, or are those just like different altogether?
They're yeah, they would be deep. I guess so recurrent neural networks. It's sort of like this thing might not be very deep, but because the data is going through it over and over, it kind of acts as if it was deeper. I don't know, similar to if you've seen like recursive filters can have a very long impulse response, even though there may be very few multiplies inside the filter. It's the same idea. And yeah, some of these approaches, maybe I shouldn't have put them all in the same list. Some of these are more about ways of training rather than like ways of architecting. But I can be more explicit in a few more slides. Okay. Any other questions on this page? Okay. So just today I made a few more slides. Been meaning to do this for a while. Okay. Yeah, but because we had some extra time today, I thought this was a good time to do it. Okay, so all right, so there's a class of networks called autoencoders. And autoencoders, they kind of look like this. You have an input, and there's an encoder network that takes the dimensionality from high dimensional to low dimensional. And there's a decoder network that takes the dimensionality from low back up to the original one. And overall, you train this so that the outputs are as close to the inputs as possible. So in some sense, you could say that you're building like a compression, decompression network, or encoding, decoding. You're trying to like distill the data into what's really most important about it, not more, not less, and then build it back up. If you make this dimension too small, then there's no way that you can really describe the data, and then this will never be the same as this. And if you make this too big, you're kind of defeating the whole purpose here of what you're trying to do, which is you're trying to like squeeze out all the redundancies in the data and just get to the real core of the data, exactly what you need to describe it. Okay, so that's what an autoencoder is. And let me just give you some examples of why this could be useful. So dimensionality reduction is a general idea where you start with some high dimensional things, and like as a form of compression, you just want to represent it using things that are much lower dimensional. We will talk about this more. We'll talk about PCA in detail in Unit 11. This is like fancier than PCA because there's nonlinearities in here. Another idea is denoising, which we mentioned before. So it's kind of like if I've trained this autoencoder to be good, and then I put in a noisy version of one of these images, the noise is going to get stripped out because this is only really good at encoding things that describe the images. So the noise will probably get stripped out when you put this noisy thing here, through here, and then when you come back, you'll get a clean image. So it's one way you can use autoencoders, or one way you can even train them. Anomaly detection. So anomaly detection is the problem in machine learning where you have a data set where maybe there's a few outliers where the things in the data set they don't really belong there, and you're trying to figure out which ones they are. And so if you train this kind of network, what it's going to do, it's probably going to learn to reconstruct the average item in your data set, but if there's an outlier, it's probably not going to be able to represent that well. So you'll see the difference between input and output on the outliers will be much larger than on the rest of the data. So it's sort of a way of doing that. And then generative modeling, which I'll talk a lot more about in the next few slides. You could try to train something like this, and once it's trained, if you have also trained these to look like Gaussian noise or something like that, then once it's trained, you can get rid of the encoder, just keep the decoder, and then feed it with new random Gaussian noise samples, and then if everything is working, you will get samples that look like your original data. So, and so that's really, so if you're doing that task, you want to take this approach called variational autoencoders, which instead of just taking a vector x and getting a vector z out, what you're actually doing is you're taking your vector x, and this network is going to encode a mean vector and let's say a variance vector. And then what you're going to do is you're going to say, okay, I'm going to make Gaussian samples by taking my mean and adding some unit variance Gaussian times my standard deviation. And now these samples will be Gaussian samples, and I'm going to train this whole thing so that the encoder learns a good mean and variance, such that the Gaussian samples here put through the decoder will match the input. And so here's how you train that. So this is the mu and sigma would be like maybe going from xi to those. So for every input data xi, the encoder would compute what it thinks is the right mean vector, what it thinks is the right variance vector. Then we're doing this element-wise multiplication times a random zero mean unit variance Gaussian. So now this is going to be some colored Gaussian sample. You're going to put that through your decoder, and you want this whole thing is kind of like your x hat I. You want that your x hat I is close to your true xi. Okay, so this part is saying, make sure that whatever I put in, I get something close at the output. The second term is saying, not only that, but I want to make sure that that when I learn these means and the mean and standard deviation here, overall I'm going to try to make this mean close to 0 and the standard deviation close to 1. So I'm going to try to drive these z's towards a zero mean unit variance Gaussian. So it doesn't learn something crazy. So you can do that with this so-called KL divergence, Kullback-Leibler divergence, which is a way of computing the difference between two distributions, so this Gaussian and this Gaussian. So that's basically how you train them. There's actually a lot more details, other really nice interpretations of what's going on. If you want to click this link, you can see all the math. Yeah, so these approaches were big in the maybe like 7 years ago or so. They were pretty popular. But the performance you got for generative modeling, it never really gave you very crisp images. It worked, but they didn't look like amazing. You wouldn't have been fooled as a human thinking, yeah, this is really like a face, a true face, or whatever. Okay, but so that led to the next advance. I'll show you on the next page. But are there any questions? Anything so far? Okay, so you have some design decisions to make. You have to, choose the kind of network you're going to use here. It's probably going to be convolutional, but then the question is like, what's the overall architecture of that? To choose the latent dimension and so on. Okay, so there was a big advance made using these things called GANs, generative adversarial networks. And so the goal, this is this generative modeling goal. I give you a training set of n training images. Maybe they're faces that look kind of like this. And your goal is to generate new samples that look similar to those faces. So this is an example from one of the papers that shows some of the training faces. There's probably like millions of them. And then these are some of the generated faces. And they're really good. Like as a human, it's hard to say. It's hard to tell that these are fake, right? Some of them like, I don't know. This one looks a little bit weird. Like there's that little, looks like she got punched in the jaw or something. But overall they're good. Or like this ear. So you can see it's not perfect. Or this guy's beard is uneven. So there are little things like if you look closely. But overall, as you can see, they really look like, they could be photographs of actual humans. And this particular task is a little more challenging because these faces are not centered, like they can be off to the edge, clipped, and so on. If you do this with a data set that has all the faces centered, then what you get looks really good. It's hard to tell that they're fake. Okay, so GANs were this huge advance. They were generating these really high quality, crisp images. And so this is how they work. So we're going to design a generator that takes in a random white Gaussian code vector, or latent vector, Z, and it's going to map that to the image domain. So it's essentially doing exactly this. So we're just going to be training this thing to take Gaussian samples to faces or whatever you want, whatever the data set you're working with. Okay, now what's interesting is you're going to design what's called a discriminator, which is a classifier network, a binary classifier network, that classifies whether the input is a real image or a fake image. So, given these samples and these samples during training, we know that these are fake because we generated them. We know these are real as our training data. So we give these as supervised labels to this classifier, and we train this to do as good a job to determining that these are fake and these are real. It's going to output, so D is going to output a number between 0 and 1, where larger numbers would mean real, smaller numbers would mean fake. Okay? And so now what's interesting is we're going to jointly train the two of these things together. Typically what that means is you take, I think maybe you do one epoch training your generator, then maybe one epoch training your discriminator, and you alternate back and forth. So they keep getting better. Each one keeps getting better and better. The generator tries to learn to fool the discriminator, and the discriminator tries to keep up with the generator and learn when it's faking and when it's, when it has the true trained samples. And so the cost that you use to train your generator looks like this. So cost meaning we want to decrease this. So what we have here is this is the output of the generator, which depends on some parameters phi. And this is going into our discriminator. So now it's going to return a variable between 0 and 1. And the generator wants the discriminator to think that this is a real sample. So it wants to make this large, or it wants to make the minus sign, small, because it wants to make that cost small. So this is what the generator is trained. This is its loss function on its parameters phi. So the discriminator at this moment is fixed, and we're just training the generator with this loss function. Then we're going to freeze the generator, and then we're going to train the discriminator with this loss function. And so this is essentially, this is the case where we give the discriminator the true training samples. So the discriminator wants to recognize that these are actually the true ones. So that means it wants to make D large. And so we have, minus average over the training log D. So it's trying to minimize this term because it's a loss. And then it's also trying to minimize this term. So for this term, we're generating random Gaussians, putting them into our generator. So now these are the fake ones. And it is outputting numbers that we want to try to drive small because we want those to be the fake ones. So that's what this minus sign is encouraging them to be small. Okay, so these are the two loss functions, and we iterate back and forth. And I think this started in around 2014, if I remember right. And it's been going. I think this latest style GAN is, I'm trying to remember if it's maybe a couple years old, something like that. So over the years, so when this method was first invented, it was very unstable. It was very hard to train because this, like you would find things would just explode and go off to infinity and do crazy stuff. And so these things got a reputation for being very difficult to work with. But actually, it's really not very bad. There was a lot of advancements made in how you train it. And as a result, at least my students say it's very stable. It works very well, my PhD students. And so we haven't had any troubles with this stuff. It seems to work just really well, and you can get just really amazing results. So this is a very powerful method, and it's once the generator is trained, it's very fast to generate samples because it's just like you put in Gaussian samples through a neural network and out come images from your training class. So it's kind of amazing. Any questions? Yeah.
Are there ethical issues associated with making up fake people? Like, could that be used for like nefarious purposes?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of concerns, but
Yeah.
the ethical issues are more about fairness. So it's about things like, if I train this on a data set that is, let's say, like all white people and, no one else, and then I use the results of this to make decisions or allocate resources towards, heterogeneous populations that aren't all white people, then that's not fair because somehow the outputs of my generator are not describing reality. So there's been a lot of emphasis on that, for sure. And a lot of that is tied to the data sets you train with. You have to make sure the data you're training with is fair, is ethical. So, but yeah, like deep fakes. This is all about deep fakes. The other question you raised, like, can deep fakes be harmful? Yes, certainly. And this is just images. You can do this with videos. You can do this with a lot of stuff. So, and ChatGPT is, in some sense, those chatbots are doing this with text. They're not necessarily doing it with a GAN, but they're generative modelers as well. Yeah. Okay. All right. Any other questions on these? Okay. Normalizing flows are a little bit more recent, not as well investigated as GANs, but a normalizing flow. So here you could say is the generative part, where you have Gaussian noise put through a deep network to get your samples. But what's interesting about this network is that it is an invertible neural network. So its inverse exists, and you can code both of them. So that puts a lot of constraints on how the network is built. You have to be easily invertible. But assuming it's invertible, then what that means is that if you take an image and you put it through this way, through your, we call the flow, it converts that image to something that looks like Gaussian noise, and then going backwards, Gaussian noise back to the image. So the way that you train these things is you have a database of images, and you gradually adapt the parameters of this so that this looks like Gaussian noise. When you initialize, it doesn't look like Gaussian noise, but over the training iterations, you use a loss that basically says this should look like Gaussian noise. And it's a little bit more complicated than that. This is the actual loss. So you really want to do maximum likelihood. So maximum likelihood, you want to maximize the probability of the samples. But we have this, there's, maybe you remember this from your probability class. If you have a transformation of a random variable, you can write the probability of the transformed random variable using a formula that involves a Jacobian and a determinant. This is also something similar to, like, if you change variables inside an integral, you have a similar thing. So, so this ends up being the likelihood. And here you can see we're taking an image, we're converting that to something that we hope is Gaussian noise. And then here is we're measuring the likelihood, that this is zero mean unit variance Gaussian noise. But there's also this Jacobian term. So this is the Jacobian. The Jacobian is like a gradient, except it's a gradient of a function that returns more than one output. So it's like so the Jacobian is a matrix where every column in that matrix is the gradient with respect to one of the outputs. Okay, so that's what this is. So this is the Jacobian, and then you take the determinant of that matrix, it's a square matrix, and look at the absolute value of it. So this is the loss, this is maximum likelihood. This is a lot easier than what we did with the GANs, because with GANs, you have to make this whole classifier network, you have to train them jointly and so on. This one, you're just exploiting the invertibility, and you can minimize this directly, and this is straightforward as long as this operation is tractable. So not only does it have to be invertible, but the network has to be chosen so that the determinant of the Jacobian is easy to compute. So that puts some constraints a lot of constraints in your network, but people have come up with some really clever ways to make that tractable. And these are some of the more well-known approaches. And then like the globe, this is, state of the art for like, nearly state of the art, let's say for image generation. I think they were showing that they were beating the GANs at the time. So it was working really well. Okay, so those are flows. Any questions on these? And then the last one are diffusion models, which are kind of the rage right now. So diffusion models, again, the goal is to do generative modeling. And what you do is here you have an image, and using multiple steps, this could be hundreds of steps, perhaps, you gradually make that image more and more noisy until you have something that just completely resembles white Gaussian noise. This is what they call forward diffusion. That's very easy, right? It's very easy to add noise and a bit more noise and a bit more noise. The objective, though, is to go backwards, is to say, well, if I know this process, can I figure out how to do the opposite? Can I figure out how to remove a bit of noise, and so on? And once you figure out how to do that, so you actually train a network to do that, then you can start with random noise, and you can start there and go backwards, and then finally get images or whatever you want. And so, so forward diffusion, this Q, this is like the probability distribution of xt given xt minus 1. That's very easy. Basically, there's different ways to do it, but this is one way. You just multiply xt minus 1 by a number a little bit less than 1. So this is the new mean, and then this is and then you add Gaussian noise with zero mean Gaussian noise with variance beta t. So this is what you do every time you go this way. And the reason why you have this particular scaling like here is that so the overall energy from here to here stays the same. So the mean shrinks a little bit, but then you add variance. Right? So if you looked at the expected squared 2 norm of xt would be the same as xt minus 1. Okay, now backwards diffusion is much more challenging. It's not clear how to go backwards, but the way this is done in practice is that you make the approximation that this is also Gaussian, and you train a neural network that puts out the mean and the variance, very similar to what we saw with variational autoencoders. And then the whole question is, how do you design this? And this network could also be aware of which step t it's at. So essentially, that's the objective. The math is a bit intense, but if you want to see the math, this is a pretty nice, click on that, that's a pretty nice overview. And these are some of the landmark papers that are around, I don't know, two years old or so pretty recent, 2-3 years old. So what's the reason why these things have gotten so popular is that, so all the methods I talked about today, this one, all this stuff you can do conditionally, where not only are you just trying to take like random noise and make it into something, you have conditional information. So you say like, I want you to generate someone with glasses. So if you can somehow train it so that it understands glasses, then you can get a picture of someone with glasses. Just as an example, you can condition it to do something specific. And not only can you make it conditional, but you can also work jointly with images and text together. And so this has been really famous lately, where you say, generate for me like a photo of a Shiba Inu dog with a backpack riding a bike. It's wearing sunglasses and a beach hat. That is a conditional information. And then it basically uses diffusion to map some noise to an image, and it generates a really cool looking image of that. So you might have heard of some of these. DALL-E, Imagen, that's Google's. Stable Diffusion is OpenAI's. And these ones are made from Imagen, but all these methods are super high quality. So this is how people have been generating AI art lately. And even ChatGPT is essentially doing this kind of stuff, but just with text. Actually, the most recent version is text and images. But it's just trained with, lots and lots and lots of text to try to predict the next and the next and the next word in a sentence or a paragraph or whatever. So just wanted to let you know kind of how what we've talked about relates to a lot of the current cutting edge. So yeah, if you're interested, I tried to come up with, this is a nice blog that I thought, simplified it so you can try to understand it without reading the original papers, but of course you can read them too, and you can play with all this stuff. These are just links to those, the websites where you can get access to the code. So it's pretty fun stuff. All right, so that's perfect timing. Are there any questions on diffusion models or anything? Okay, all right. Well, that's it for this unit then. And so what we'll do, maybe on Wednesday, I'm toying with the idea of doing a review. I didn't do a review last time because most semesters I've done a review before the midterms, but then I started wondering, well, if I review it for you in class, does that mean you're not going to do any studying on your own? And I think studying on your own is much more powerful than listening to me review it. So, I don't know. Would you guys want me to do a review of units 5 through 8? Okay. Seeing a lot of nodding. So, but just promise me that doesn't mean you're not going to study on your own. But I can do that on Wednesday. And then that means that on next week, we can start our unit on ensemble methods, and it's going to be pretty short, just probably 2 lectures. So, and at that point, you will have everything you need for your project. So I'm also going to try to get your project posted in the next couple weeks or so.
Are you still going to have office hours Thursday as well?
This week?
Yeah.
I will, yes. Although my office hours this Thursday need to be online. But yeah, on Zoom, but I'll have them. Okay. All right. See you guys Wednesday.